All right, we're within 1 minute of the starting time, so I'm going to go ahead and go. I have a ton of stuff to cover, so we're going to go pretty quick, but you will have the recording afterwards, and all of the sample code that I show, I'll make sure you have it by the end. So don't worry if there's something that goes by too fast in terms of code. I'll try and make sure that any of the concepts are pretty clear. If there's anything that you want me to go back to, feel free to raise your hand and let me know. I'll try and cover it. If you have a more open-ended question, I'm more than happy to answer them afterwards. So my name's Rob Howard. I'm a program manager on the Office Developer Platform team. We own extensibility for the Office clients and for our servers, SharePoint, Exchange, Link, and for our services in Office 365. And today I'm going to talk to you guys about everything new in SharePoint. Basically try and touch on as much as possible that's new since we RTM'd a little over a year ago with SharePoint 2013. And it's going to be a pretty packed hour of a bunch of different demos. We're going to start with a really quick refresher on the app model. For those of you guys who aren't familiar, I'll try and give you a little bit of context of what the app model is in SharePoint. But I'll go pretty quickly there, and most of the demos won't really have a dependency on having a deep understanding of it. But there'll certainly be a bunch of resources to go and check out later if you want more information on it. Then I'm going to talk about what's new in apps for SharePoint. So we've done a bunch of work since we released apps for SharePoint to enhance the capabilities there, both on-prem and online, and I'll talk about a few things that are new there. But the focus of it will be on a bunch of work we've done more recently to make it really easy and really powerful to extend device apps and websites with services that are coming from Office 365, from SharePoint, from Exchange Online, and really enriching the applications that you build using that. And along the way, we're going to do a ton of demos. I always try and do demos that are from scratch, so almost all of them are going to be file new project demos, so you can kind of see the whole thing, nothing up my sleeve. And I'll make sure that all the snippets that I use throughout it, I'll give you a link to go and download all those snippets, so if you want to play along at home and go and rebuild things on your own, you're more than welcome to afterwards. All right, so my quick recap of the SharePoint app model. It's a relatively big and complex topic, but I'm going to try and break it down into 3 simple things. The first thing that we have in the SharePoint app model is that we've taken the custom code that you write and moved it off of the SharePoint box to really any other place that you want to write it, to a website, to a device application, and that's that custom client code that's running on the bottom. And then we've got a series of libraries to call from that client code, JavaScript, Silverlight, and .NET libraries, as well as REST endpoints, happen to be OData REST endpoints, to call functionality on the SharePoint server. Things like lists and libraries, user profiles, search, taxonomy, feeds, pretty much any functionality that you can get to in SharePoint, we try and expose an API for it so you can build your custom application and leverage that capability. So we've got these cross-platform APIs that you can call either through these libraries or from anywhere that can make an HTTP request from any platform that you can imagine. That's the first piece. The second is we've got an authentication and authorization model that allows that remote code to act on behalf of users in SharePoint in a controlled way, in a way where they get to approve, here's exactly the set of permissions I want to give that code, the things it can do on my behalf, and then that code's allowed to call into SharePoint, even if it's running remotely, and act on behalf of the users of that application to perform actions or access services on their behalf. And again, it's all done in the context of permissions that the user has explicitly approved and in the identity of the application. So when, say, the Power BI application calls into SharePoint and does something, SharePoint's tracking that in the version history and the audit log that it was Power BI performing an operation on behalf of a particular user. And the last piece is we've got a bunch of extension points inside the SharePoint UI where your custom application can add new functionality or add new user interface directly within the experience. We've got full page applications if you want to have just essentially a web page that you can kind of control the entire experience, but you want that to be launched within the context of SharePoint. We certainly have that. We've got these part page apps where you can take a page from your app and embed it in an app part, the same way you would use like a web part inside of a SharePoint page. And then we've got a bunch of command extensions, places within the SharePoint UI where we allow you to plug in additional functionality to say, add to the ribbon or add to menus in SharePoint to have some custom application functionality that you extend it. So in a nutshell, that's really what the SharePoint app model is. It's those 3 things, those remote APIs, the authentication infrastructure that allows you to act on behalf of users, and then some ways to plug into the UI so that you can extend the actual experience inside of SharePoint. In terms of sort of the history, it's relatively new. We introduced it more or less for the first time at 2 SharePoint conferences ago, which was November of 2012. Actually, Scott Guthrie stood on stage, did a bunch of cool demos of building Azure-hosted SharePoint apps that interacted with SharePoint services. And we really think of it as a brand new way to interact with SharePoint, and for 2 major reasons. One is that it allows you to pick whatever web technology you want. You're not stuck running inside of SharePoint's little pegs that they expose inside of the W3WP process. You can run on whatever Azure role. You can take advantage of the latest functionality from .NET. You can use MVC if you want, even though SharePoint doesn't. You could even write your application in PHP, or you could write your application in Java. It's really your choice in terms of the technologies you want to build your application on, and you just integrate with SharePoint services through standard web technologies. And then the other key thing is that the old model of really dropping a DLL on the front end of servers only worked in on-premises environments. So it meant that you couldn't build an application that would work both on-prem and in Office 365 with that approach. And the real key here was that we designed something that allows you to build a single application that can work on-prem and Office 365 with a minimal amount of code that understands the difference between the two. Since then, we've had a ton of usage. Actually, I don't even have the numbers for February, but in January, we had over 2 billion API calls to the service through this app model. So a huge amount of traffic just in Office 365. That doesn't even include the majority of our usage, which is still on premises. We have major ISVs like DocuSign, Nintex, AvePoint, K2, all building applications either for distribution in our marketplace or directly to customers. We have a ton of customers building their own sort of internal and corporate apps, from small customers to really large customers. And especially for larger customers that have a big investment in legacy fully trusted code solutions, there's a bunch of folks that are rewriting those solutions to work in the app model so they have more flexibility about where it runs, and they can transition their SharePoint infrastructure to the cloud. But there's a lot more to be done. For one thing, the model was a V1. We exposed a bunch of stuff. We thought it was really powerful. We've seen a bunch of people do really cool stuff with it, but we need more. We need to expose more. We need to refine it. We need more functionality. And to that end, we are continuously improving the service. We update the service at least every couple of weeks, sometimes on a daily basis even, with either fixes or new functionality. We're also updating on-premises and adding new functionality to on-premises for the app model through CUs. So on a regular basis, you'll see new things come in through the app model. Just in the April CU in SharePoint, we exposed a bunch of new functionality related to site provisioning and branding, which is a scenario that I'll talk about in a second. And then as a result, these client for interacting with these services, we have to update those on a regular basis, and we're now updating them on a quarterly basis. In addition, it's a whole new model, and there was a huge amount of effort put into fully trusted code solutions for a long time. So we need more and more guidance that tells people, hey, the sort of thing that you would do this way in fully trusted code, this is how you can accomplish that same thing in the app model, and here's all the new scenarios that you can also do in the app model that you never could do in fully trusted code. To that end, we're announcing this effort to create a bunch of what we call solution packs that are really focused on specific scenarios, where we say, hey, this is a really common thing people want to do with SharePoint, and we're creating a bunch of documentation that's focused on that scenario, some fully functional end-to-end applications, and a bunch of sample code that's a whole package around a specific workload. In this case, we're releasing the first one. We released it a couple weeks ago. It's available today. It's on site provisioning and branding, which is a really common workload for companies inside of SharePoint. And that's available on MSDN and has a whole bunch of code samples, like I mentioned, and end-to-end applications there. We'll continue to iterate on more solution packs. We'll add additional ones. We'll iterate on the ones that we have. And we are establishing an open source project on CodePlex that all the source that we bring to these solution packs is coming from. And I'll give you a pointer to that in just a second. And then the last thing is that as we iterate on the service and as we expose more scenarios, we want to do it in a faster way. We want to bring new functionality to you faster than we've ever been able to before. But that can be really disruptive. We can try and get things out the door too fast. It may not be quite right. It may interfere with production services. So really, we wanted to come up with a way where we can say, anybody can get to this functionality. It's public functionality. But we're going to do it in a way where it's very specifically marked as preview functionality. So you can take a look. You can play with it. You can build on it. And you can give us your feedback about how you think it works, how you think it could be better, and we can continuously improve that in the service. These are all going to be service features. And then we'll take that feedback and iterate on it, and eventually we'll say, hey, we think we've got it right now. We're going to make it generally available. And in the next major release on-premises, we'll bring those same features to the on-premises product as well. And I'll talk about quite a few preview features that we've announced in the last couple weeks for the rest of the talk. That public open source CodePlex project for all those app model samples where the solution packs are coming from, here's the info on that. It's called officeams.codeplex.com. It's called app model samples. There's a ton of code in there, a lot of it written by Microsoft consultants and rangers who have had customer engagement, some contributed by customers and individuals in the public. A lot of really valuable code for accomplishing a bunch of very common tasks in the app model. If you go to the front page, there's a list of a couple dozen scenarios that they cover and have end-to-end samples to show you how to accomplish them. And this is a really great resource. And it's what we'll continue to pull stuff from when we build these end-to-end solution packs for additional scenarios in the future. The last thing I want to say in kind of the overview is that we absolutely want you to keep the feedback coming. All the information about what are the most important scenarios for us to have better documentation around, and what are the missing remote APIs that we need, and what are the things that could be made easier and that you spend a lot of time on and that you have to recreate from scratch every time you build this. We want to hear about that. That's what's been motivating the work we've been doing since RTM, and we want it to continue to motivate that. And to that end, we've got a site up on user voice. And that's the primary place where we're listening at this point. When you want to ask us about, hey, there's a remote API that's missing, there's a feature that you need, there's some documentation that you feel is wrong or missing, go up to user voice, add your comment there. Other folks will vote it up. We're watching that very closely. A bunch of the features that we'll talk about today are in response to that user voice feedback already. In addition, when you have questions, when you have a problem that you can't solve, when you want to know how to do something, we're really focusing our effort on listening in a single place, and that's Stack Overflow. And we've got 2 tags there that we're watching very closely. One for Office development, if you're building apps for Office or interactivity with Office from any of the extensibility mechanisms in Office, and SharePoint for anything related to SharePoint, obviously. And then, of course, we've got dev.office.com, which is sort of our hub for developer information. So when you want to get to any documentation that we have, should be available from dev.office.com. When you want to find the latest tools or the latest links to how to sign up for a developer tenant in Office 365, all that's on dev.office.com. And then we've got a blog on MSDN, the Office Apps blog, that has all the latest information about new features that we're releasing, updates to features. When we release a new preview feature or a new tool, it'll all be on there. You can find all that information. I definitely recommend you watch the blog for future updates on new preview features. Okay, so that's the end of my introduction. I then just want to give you a little bit of context for the rest of the talk, which I'll do very quickly. And basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of break down the Office App Platform into 2 categories. One is what we call contextual apps. And what you see here is this is a picture of Outlook. This is Outlook Web Access. In the middle here, there is a custom application. This is a custom application. It's a web page, an app for Office that's embedded inside the experience. It's taking the context of this particular message and it's enriching it. It's getting a bunch of information from that and using its web services to enrich it and provide a custom experience based on that. That's one of the models, and we have a bunch of those models both inside of Office, in the rich clients and in the web, and inside of SharePoint. And in general, those are things that we call apps for Office and SharePoint. Typically, when you get those, you're going to go get them from the Office store, or you have an organizational catalog where your organization has created their own applications. You're extending the experience of Office and SharePoint. You're creating things that are embedded inside that experience or enriching that experience. It's not a sort of standalone experience. And typically, the most efficient tools for going and creating those are the project templates in the Office Developer Tools for Visual Studio. There's a second category, and it's one that we're really focusing on making really rich very recently. And that's these standalone device apps and websites. And I'll show a bunch of demos from this today. This will really be the big focus. And this is, you can kind of think of it as just a regular website out on the internet or a device app that you go get from any device store, whether it be iOS or Android or Windows. And those are independent applications that aren't embedded in the Office 365 experience, but they're using REST and OAuth to take advantage of and interact with Office 365 through services. And we've got a bunch of tools that I'll talk about in a minute and that you've probably seen at least mentions of or demos in other talks for interacting and building applications using Visual Studio. And then we've got a bunch of SDKs that we'll talk about for building on other platforms other than Windows. So those are kind of the 2 categories. I'm going to do a couple of real quick things on these contextual experiences, and then I'll do the rest of the talk on device apps and websites. So We're going to talk first about what's new in app for SharePoint. So these are those contextual experiences. And the first thing that I'll talk about is that we've introduced a bunch of new remote APIs. I kind of covered this already. This is really for you to refer back to later. But as part of that site provisioning and branding content, we said, hey, when we went and built that guidance and built that end-to-end solution, we found a bunch of remote APIs that would be really useful to have that we didn't have coverage on. And we added those. There's some that were in SP1. There are some that are in the April CU. They're all available in the service. Now we feel like we have a pretty great end-to-end solution for creating custom site provisioning experiences. And I'm going to do a really quick demo of that right now. So I'm going to go inside Visual Studio. If I can type in my password correctly. So I'm going to go to Visual Studio, and I'm going to create a new project. File, new project. Like I mentioned, we have these templates inside Visual Studio for creating apps for Office and apps for SharePoint. I'm going to go create an app for SharePoint, site provisioning demo. Oh, I already have a project called that, site provisioning demo 2. And it's going to let me choose a site to debug against. I'm going to choose my Office 365 developer site. I could also choose an on-premises site. This demo will work in both places. And it's going to ask me where I want to host my app. I'm going to choose a provider-hosted app because I'd like to host the code in a place of my choice as the provider of the application. So I'm going to choose an ASP.NET website. I'm going to hit Finish. It's going to let me sign in to that site for debugging purposes. And you'll see that it's going to go create a project or a solution with 2 different projects inside of it. One is the SharePoint app project. That's the kind of basis for all the installation into SharePoint and the permissions that it has within SharePoint. And any SharePoint-specific assets I want to create. That's this one up here with the little SharePoint logo. And then there's just an ASP.NET Web Forms website. And I could use MVC or whatever else I wanted to here. Right now I've got Web Forms. And I'm just going to do the most basic demo that I can possibly imagine here. I'm going to go to the designer, and I'm going to put in a text box. So I'm going to have a site name text box. And I'm going to have a site owner text box. And then I'm going to have a button. And I'm going to change some properties on these guys. We'll call this site name. We'll call this site owner. And we'll call this create site. So I've got a really simple web page that's going to allow me to type in the name of the site I want to create. It's going to allow me to type in the owner of the site. And then I'm going to click create. And this is going to call off from this ASP.NET website into SharePoint and go say, hey, create me a new site collection. In order to create a new site collection, I'm going to need a bunch of permissions for this application. I mentioned that authorization infrastructure that allows us to talk about the app's permissions and restrict what the app can do. So I need to request some specific permissions. And if I want to create new site collections, I need write permissions to the tenant. So I'm going to ask for that. And the other thing is, that I, as a user of this application, may not have permission to go create a site collection in my organization. So my app may need to sort of elevate permissions and make the call as just the app instead of doing it on behalf of the user. So I'm going to check this box to say allow app to make app-only calls. Now I've got the frame of my page, and I'm just going to go and add in some quick code. This is the default template that's in there. It handles creating a context and getting all of the OAuth codes for me. I'm just going to delete the basic code in page load, and I'm going to go here and create a button on click handler. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create an app-only access token. And there's a little helper code that gets here in the project that allows me to go create that app-only token in a really quick way. Again, this is going to essentially allow me to elevate so that I'm only calling on behalf of the app. My user is not going to be considered in the call. So if the user doesn't have permission to create a site collection, that's no big deal. Then I'm going to set up some site creation properties. You'll see I can set things here like the URL, which I'm using that site name field for, the owner, which I'm using the site owner field for. I can set the template, the title, the storage that I want to have, both for warning and the maximum, the time zone, the user code maximum. There's a bunch of different options for how I go and provision that thing. And you'll see there's this site creation properties object. In order to resolve that, I need a reference to that new updated DLL that I talked about, our client libraries for tenant administration. This is Microsoft.online.sharepoint.client.tenant. Don't be fooled by the clever name. It actually works on-prem as well as online. So I'm going to hit OK. And I'm going to resolve this site creation properties class. And then the last thing I'm going to do is just go and create the site. So you see I'm going to take that app-only access token. I'm going to create a client context. I'm going to create the tenant from that client context, and I'm going to call create site on that tenant. You'll see I get back an SPO operation, which I'll show you in just a second what that is. And I'm going to call load and execute query, which will send it across to the server. And then I'm going to hit start. SharePoint's going to package all that up inside of or Visual Studio is going to package all that up inside of my SharePoint app package. It's going to go to my dev site on SharePoint Online, and it's going to deploy that package. And then it's going to spin up an IIS Express website locally in order to run the ASP.NET web application that I created. That's big. You guys can see that, right? I'm going to log in. And it's going to ask me, do I trust this particular demo? The permissions that I asked for, I have to go and approve. I'm going to say, yeah, I trust it. And now I'm going to get that really basic website. Test 1, 2, 3, 4. Hopefully I haven't called it that before. And now I have to, I hit back too many times. Test 1, 2, 3, 4. And now I have to type in the email address of the owner, which is kind of lame. It'd be nice if I had a way to pick that easily. And I'll hit create site. And at the same time, I'll go, so we hit a breakpoint. You'll see that I can actually debug against it because it's running locally on IIS. My code's running locally even though it's interacting with a SharePoint Online a cloud application. And you'll see if I go to this SPO operation, this is essentially a handle to the operation that I just did because it can take a while to go create a site collection. So this SPO operation is telling me, has the operation completed? Has it timed out? And what's the next interval that I should pull it on if I want to go and pull it and keep up to date with the status? In this particular case, I'm just going to let it go. And then I'm going to go to the admin site for SharePoint so you can actually see that site creating, if everything went well. And there you see it, test 1, 2, 3, 4, and the application's creating. So you can imagine all kinds of really robust end-to-end workflows you could create around it, approvals for doing custom site provisioning, a bunch of customization that I do to the site after it's created to customize the branding or the content inside of it. If you go to Office AMS, there's a ton of different solutions that actually do that end-to-end. They'll show you how to integrate workflow with the process. They'll show you how to integrate custom themes and all of that with the provisioning process inside of Office AMS. All right, so I'm going to go back real quick to the slides. And mention one other thing that we had as a big gap when we were at RTM. So we have this app for SharePoint Store, this Office Store, that supported distribution directly to customers through the Office Store. We supported a bunch of different models, free, trial, paid. There's a 20% revenue share with Microsoft when you distribute through that store, but you can also distribute directly to customers directly in their corporate catalog. And we supported both a per-seat price and an organization-wide price. So we had a bunch of different licensing models. But the one that, especially when people are hosting a cloud infrastructure that they really wanted, we didn't support until relatively recently, which is subscriptions, which are now available for applications in the store. So you can build your applications both to have a single one-time payment per user or per organization, or you can have a recurring payment based on monthly subscriptions. So just wanted to mention that. And real quick, go back and say, remember that thing that we just created? Remember the UI that we had, especially on the site owner field, where I had to type in the email address manually. I didn't have a picking experience. If I built that application directly within SharePoint, I'd use a people picker control. I'd have a really nice experience for resolving that. And by writing this thing outside of SharePoint on this custom ASP.NET website, I sort of lost the capability to leverage that people picker experience. And as a result, if I want to go and build it, it's a whole bunch of code I have to rewrite. It's a whole bunch, and it's much more expensive for me to build the solution as a result. So to that end, we're announcing the first of the preview features that I mentioned called Office Web Widgets. And Office Web Widgets are available now. You can actually go get them in a NuGet package. If you go to NuGet.org or if you go to the NuGet Explorer inside of Visual Studio, you can type in Office Widgets and you'll find the Office Web Widgets. They are HTML and JavaScript UI controls. They allow you to really quickly integrate them into any web platform that you want to, whether you're building on PHP or ASP.NET or MVC. Because they're built using HTML and JavaScript, they're easy to integrate in all those. And they allow you to also listen to the events. So they're not just sort of dumb standalone controls. When you pick that user, you can get that event so that your application can use that inside of its business logic. And we've got two that are inside of this initial preview, a people picker and a list view, which essentially reproduce the same user interface that you'd get if you were building inside of SharePoint. So you can see the quick people picker up here, and you can see a list view here that's rendered. This is running inside a page, not inside of SharePoint, but in a custom ASP.NET application. So real quick, I'm going to do a demo of taking this same application that I built and replacing the email field here with a people picker control. So I'm going to go back to the site provisioning demo. I'm going to stop this. One thing that is a potential hang-up that I'll warn you about, and this is definitely something we want to improve in future versions of the control, it actually has a dependency on there being an app web inside of the app because it's going to use the cross-domain library in order to talk back and forth. So I'm going to go here and I'm going to add a new item, and I'm just going to add an empty element. I don't actually need anything inside of this, but Visual Studio will automatically go and create the app web if I just add something there, even if I go ahead and delete it. I'm looking for this package to be created inside the SharePoint project. Once I have that, integrating the controls is pretty easy. I can go to Manage NuGet Packages. I can search for Office Widgets. You can see Office Web Widgets Experimental right there. I can hit Install, accept the license. It added a bunch of CSS and JavaScript files, so you'll see Office Controls CSS, Office Controls JS, Office Controls List View JS, Office Controls People Picker JS. It automatically added them to my project, and then I can go ahead and add them to the page. So I'm going to go to the source code here, and the first thing I'm going to do is add in some references. You'll see that I've got a reference to the CSS class. I've got a reference to SP Request Executor, which if you aren't familiar with, this is the cross-domain library in SharePoint that allows me from JavaScript to talk back and forth. You're not actually going to use it directly, but the controls will, and that's why I needed to add that package to the project. And then I've got office.controls.js and office.controls.peoplepicker.js. And I'm going to go and right under this site owner column, I'm going to add in the simple markup for hosting a people picker. You'll see that it's just a simple div, but it's got this attribute on it, data.office.control, office.controls.peoplepicker. This is telling Office controls infrastructure, hey, this is a people picker, go and find this HTML element and add the functionality there. In order to actually make it work, we've got to go and put some code in the bodyOnLoad method or some other initialization place. And I'm going to put in bodyOnLoad, and you can see it's pretty simple. I'm just initializing the runtime and then calling render all, which tells it to go and find all the controls with that data.office.control on the page and actually start rendering them. And then I could actually hit F5 and I could run this page, but there's a problem with the page right now, and that is that right now I can pick the person, but it will just be sitting there in the control. The value that I picked won't actually be connected to that ASP.NET control. So I'm going to use the events on this in order to connect those two things. So I've got this people picker control, and I can add some additional options to this control. I'll show you the syntax for that. You'll see that there's this data-office-options attribute, and it's got what looks like a little JSON body inside of it. I've got an attribute right here called placeholder, which is just a property of the control that's saying the placeholder text that you put inside of the people picker should be this custom text I specified. You can also specify things like whether you want to allow more than one person to be selected or one person to be selected. And then what we really want to specify, which is the JavaScript event to call when the people picker changes. So you see I've got onChange here, and I'm referring to a JavaScript function called handle people picker change. So I'm going to go and add that to my page. You can see it's a pretty simple one. It's just a JavaScript function that's passed some arguments, and one of the properties of the arguments is selected items. If there's at least one selected item, then I'm going to go and find this site owner field, which is going to be this ASP.NET control here. And I'm going to set its value to be the email address of the first selected item. You can also get at things like the display name or the user ID or the login name. All of that's available through that event. The one last thing I have to do is just to make sure that this ASP.NET control is really called site owner when it actually renders down to the page. I'm going to set client ID mode equals static so that it uses this ID as the HTML controls ID, and then I'm going to hit start. And Visual Studio this time is going to take a little bit longer because it's got to uninstall the app and install a new one so it can get a new app web in there. If I were to make continuous changes after I've done this, Visual Studio will be really fast. It can actually, without uninstalling and installing, just save the files up immediately as soon as I hit Control S. So that's much faster the second and third time. Not too bad this time. And I'm going to go ahead and trust it again, which again, if I weren't uninstalling the web and installing a new one, I wouldn't have to do it again. And then this time, I didn't actually hide the other site owner control. That's the other part of the demo. Pretend you can't actually see this second box down here. Actually, no, I can. Here, I'll show you how fast Visual Studio can update. What is surround? Control KS. I'll put a div in there. I'll add a style equals display none. And I'll hit save. I don't have to deploy anything. Visual Studio automatically updated the file. And I just hit F5. So that was nice, an improvement that they made in the tools. And I can say test 2, 3, 4, 5. And then this time, first of all, you'll see that that custom placeholder text that I specified is there. Please choose an owner for this site collection. And this time, I get that people picker behavior when I type in. I can see the Rob Howard result. I can see tau. So I can see that behavior directly inside the control. And I can go ahead and hit create site. And that'll again go and create site. This time the owner will be tau, and it'll pick that email field up from the people picker. And again, this is not inside a SharePoint page. This is inside whatever web platform page I want. I've still got this great people picker functionality without going and reproducing it. Hit my breakpoint there. And I'll just hit F5 here. And you can see test 2, 3, 4. So pretty cool. We've also got the people picker. In addition to the people picker, we've got a list view, which can show you any sort of list data from a SharePoint site in the same way. You integrate it in very much the same way. Add that same div, add that same data office control, refer to the list view, and then you'll be able to integrate that same list view experience from SharePoint inside of your custom applications. In terms of the roadmap on Office Web Widgets, we're just releasing the people picker and the list view preview right now. You can go and check out those NuGet packages. Definitely check it out. Give us your feedback on user voice where you find problems with them. We think we need a bunch more widgets. There's a ton of experiences inside of SharePoint that are really useful to embed inside your custom applications. These are just the first two. And we want to move to doing development on these not in a private way where we're releasing these privately sourced NuGet packages, but in a public open source project where we accept community submissions as well. So we'll be moving that to GitHub in the future, and we're going to accept submissions from anybody who wants to contribute and add their own widgets as well. Okay, so that's the part of the demo, part of the talk that I'm going to devote to stuff that's new for apps for SharePoint. There's actually a bunch of other new stuff for apps for SharePoint. There's a bunch of content on Channel 9 from the SharePoint conference that you can go check out a bunch of other detail too. But that's two of the most important things that I wanted to talk about. I'm going to focus the rest of the talk on all the new cool stuff we're doing to enable consumption of Office 365 services from within device and website apps. And I'm going to start off by showing you kind of the state of the world today for device apps that interact with Office 365. These are some screenshots of actual apps inside the Windows Store or inside other stores, in some case actually built by Microsoft, and what they're doing in order to connect to Office 365 today. And you'll see a couple of big problems. One is, and they're not necessarily doing anything wrong. This is actually because of the poor story we have for doing device app consumption from Office 365. You'll see a couple things that are wrong. One is that they're actually asking you for your username and password directly within the app, which we really would rather that they not do. We'd rather they have a way to go and get a token without ever handling your password and being able to try it against other services. Another is that you'll see there's a bunch of these site URLs in some of these where we're asking you to manually enter the URL of your SharePoint site, even your personal My Site, which can be, that can be easily 50 characters. Typing that in on a device application is a pretty heinous experience. And then on top of all of that, these device apps, because they're asking you for your username and password directly, won't work with a bunch of advanced enterprise scenarios. Things like if they're federating auth with an on-prem ADFS server or some other third-party authentication server, these applications wouldn't be able to handle it. Or if you're using multi-factor authentication and you needed to get a text message on your phone to prove that you were allowed to use this device, which is a feature that's enabled and many enterprises are adopting in Office 365, again, these applications wouldn't be able to take advantage of that. So there's a bunch of problems with that experience, and then on top of it, actually consuming and writing these applications is pretty difficult, and there's no purpose-built tooling for it either. So we have a bunch of announcements where we're really targeting this scenario, and the first of those is the support for Azure Active Directory OAuth in Office 365. And this is a preview infrastructure now that allows us to have a single authentication flow for Office 365 to get to any service related to Office 365, Azure Active Directory, Exchange, SharePoint. It's supported for both device apps and websites. It allows you to have administrator consent, so you can say the tenant admin has to consent to this thing, or every end user can consent and let you get access to the services. It's a secure protocol. It's implemented through Azure Active Directory using OAuth 2.0. It means that applications are no longer actually capturing your username and password, which is awesome. It means that they have finer-grained access, so they're not just acting as you. They're actually acting as the application on behalf of you, and you can give them less access than you have to the system. And it supports things like multi-factor authentication, federated sign-in, and even long-term access through refresh tokens. You can get a refresh token, and as long as your app's access hasn't been revoked from the service, you'll be able to continue accessing it without having to prompt the user for typing in their username and password continuously or for getting consent over and over again. I'm going to do a really quick demo of showing you the Azure portal. I'm not going to show you a whole bunch of deep things around the Azure portal here because you've probably seen it before, but I do want to point out a few specific things. So this is the Azure portal for my developer tenant in Office 365. And what you'll see in here is that I've got a couple of websites, but I've also got a directory for Rob's developer tenant. So I'm actually signed in with my Office 365 identity in the Azure portal looking at the same directory that Office 365 has. So if I go in here and I click on Rob's developer tenant, you'll see that the users are the same users that are in Office 365. These are all things that are coming directly from Office 365 resources. One thing that I want to point out here that's a little bit of a potential stumbling block is that when you first go and get an Office 365 subscription right now, you'll actually get a different experience when you go to manage.windowsazure.com and try and log in with that identity the first time. And I want to show you that real quick. I'm going to log into a different browser, if it will load, so that I can be a different user. Man. Chrome really doesn't want to load. I promise I didn't sabotage it. It actually doesn't want to load. All right, we'll sign in private. I have another in private account, but so if I go to manage.windowsazure.com and I'm logged in as a user who doesn't have permission, see, I'm signed in. I'll sign out with a different user. The first time you go and sign, oh, there's 4 instances of Chrome, spectacular. So I'm going to sign in with this cleverly named no subscription account, which, believe it or not, doesn't have a subscription to Azure. And when I hit continue, after I sign in, you'll see that it's going to give me what looks like an error page. It says, we're unable to find any subscriptions associated with this account. We're going to make this better. I promise we're going to make that better. But when you see this, don't give up. You can actually just click sign up for Windows Azure. You can sign up for a pay-as-you-go plan, and the directory is a free service as part of Azure, so it won't charge you anything as part of that. But you do have to do a separate sign-up, which is kind of ugly right now, and we'd love to improve that in the future. But I'm just making sure that you realize when you hit that experience, keep going. What you'll get in the end is you'll get this experience where you can sign in with a single account, and you can do your development, you can do your Azure management, you can do your interaction with Office 365 with those same credentials across the board. So now I'm going to show you the application tab. So the application tab is inside, again, that same directory. Just like we have a list of users, those users have usernames and credentials and all those sorts of things. We now have in Azure Active Directory the notion of an application. And I can go and add a new application here that my organization is developing. And I can say, give it a name. I'll just call it test application. I can say whether it's a web application or a native client application. I have to give it a unique name. A lot of times folks choose to use their organization's domain here to help make it unique. Hit OK. And Azure is actually going to go create this application principal in Azure Active Directory. And the most important thing is that if I go over to the configure page, you'll see that I can actually go and ask for access to a bunch of different resources from a bunch of different services. So if I go down the bottom here, you'll see, first of all, I have a client ID. I have the redirect URIs that my application sits at. You can also see that I have permissions to other applications. And by default, it's requesting sign-in permissions from Windows Azure Active Directory. But I can also request access now from Office 365 SharePoint Online. I can do things like edit or delete users' files, read users' files, get full control of site collections. I can request whatever I want here. And I can also request access to Exchange Online and get access to things like users' mail, their calendars, their contacts, and interact in the same way. And then I get a single experience for sign-on with this application through Azure Active Directory and a single experience for interacting with those particular pieces of consent. So I'll show you all of that in runtime in a minute. I'll show you actually building that application from scratch using some cool tools. I'm going to go back real quick and talk about some other problems that we have some announcements for. So the first problem I talked about was authentication. The second problem I talked about was then you have to type in that URL, especially when it's your OneDrive URL or your MySite URL. That's a really long URL to type in. You have to go find it and copy and paste. So we're announcing what we call the discovery service in order to solve this exact problem. And the discovery service allows you to say, hey, I'm an application. The user gave me access to their files. The user gave me access to their mail, their calendar. I should know where that mail and calendar is without having to ask them. So we've got a new service called the discovery service, where you can just take the token that says, yeah, the user said I can get to their files. Can you tell me where they are? And we'll point you directly to the URL where that user hosts their files. It's, again, integrated with Azure Active Directory and all the same authentication infrastructure that I was just talking about. And I'll show you a real quick demo of a running application that just shows you what the flow looks like behind the scenes. Again, it's available both for device applications and web applications. What I've got here is a really simple Windows 8 application. You'll see that it's got a URL here for api.office.com. That's where the discovery service is hosted. So it's a static URL. You always know where to get to it. There's a couple of pieces of functionality that are kind of optional. So one, if you want to kind of determine whether your user already has an Office 365 account or not, we have this first sign-in functionality where you can type in an email address. You can have the user type in an email address into the web auth broker. And I can hit next. And the discovery service will first tell me, does this user have an account on Office 365? What are the URLs for signing that user in? Do they also have a Microsoft account using that same email address? Basically, discover information for whether you need to go and have them sign up or go and point them to the service directly. Once I know that the user is an Office 365 user, and I can kind of skip that first step if I'm going to assume that, I can click Get Authorized. I get this single sign-in flow where I'm typing in the web auth broker. I'm typing my username and password into the same org ID login, so I'm not typing this into the application. And when I sign in, actually, let me sign in with a different user there. So right now, I was just signing in with my developer tenant. If I sign in with a different tenant, build O365 demo, then what you'll see is because I'm signing into a different tenant, the application doesn't just get access to my stuff automatically. It's actually going to prompt me and say, here are the things that the application wants to get to. You can see it wants to read my contacts, read my calendar, send mail as me, read my mail, read items in all site collections, sign in as you. Obviously, it doesn't actually need all this to discover. This is a pretty heavyweight application. I can even do more things, like I can see who I'm signed in on and what organization I'm part of, and I can see who the application publisher is and where the application's running. So I can get a whole bunch of data on that. I can decide, yep, I trust this application and hit OK. And the application will get back an access token. You can see that really beautiful human-readable access token string here. It's actually a base64 encoded JSON blob. And with that access token, I can then go call the discovery service And I can go back and get information about all the services that I have access to. So you can see my files is coming from SharePoint, and you can see this is the URL to the SharePoint's personal My site, automatically determined without me having to type it in. You can see I have mail from O365 Exchange, calendar from O365 Exchange, and contacts from O365 Exchange. And those are the services that are supported now, but a bunch of other workloads are currently onboarding, so we'll be able to point you at pretty much any service that this user is signed up in and that you have available as an application. I can then take that same token without having to prompt the user again and go get a token to talk to SharePoint. And I can call get files to the endpoint that I discovered. And you can see just a real quick list of here are all the files in that user's OneDrive. So an end-to-end example showing you never signing into the application, signing into the application's UI through the web auth broker, getting explicit consent for the scopes that I want to give the app access to, and automatically determining the URL where I can go find that user's files without having to ask them. All right. So that was Office 365 Discovery Services. So now we have authentication, and we have the ability to discover the right URLs. But today we have a very different story for interacting with the services across all these different platforms. So we have another preview, which is the Office 365 API preview. And this is a set of REST services across Office 365 services, SharePoint, Exchange, Azure Active Directory. That's a very simple, consistent set of REST APIs. They're OData compliant if you want to use an OData client, or just REST if that's all you care about. They allow you to get to files, lists, mail, calendar, and people and groups on behalf of a user. And it's available now in all production SharePoint, Exchange, and Azure Active Directory tenants. Again, it supports that same Azure Active Directory authentication we just talked about for the Discovery service and just showed you in the portal. And you can find those endpoints for all of those services through Discovery. So we talked about Discovery, we talked about authentication, we talked about APIs. The next thing that we need is a great experience for actually building those applications using a client SDK tailored to the platform that I want to build it on. And the first one of those that we're announcing is the Office 365 SDK for Android. And the Office 365 SDK for Android is an open source project available on GitHub today. You can go check it out. You can make contributions to it. There's a bunch of tests and sample code inside there if you want to see how to use it. It's a native SDK for building native Android applications against the Office 365 APIs. And there's specific functionality in there right now for files, lists, mail, and calendar. And it integrates with the Azure Active Directory authentication library for Android in order to handle auth in the same way. So I'll show you a real quick demo of super basic application. This is actually an application that's in, Eclipse crashed. This is actually an application that's in the open source project, in the GitHub project for the Android SDK, so you can download it and run it there. Eclipse isn't quite as fast to launch as Visual Studio is. I'm actually going to go back to the slides as soon as I get this back up, and I'll come back and show it to you. I want to make sure and get the emulator running because the emulator takes a long time to go to. How many people have actually done Android programming with Eclipse? I did it for the first time when we started this project several months ago, and I have to say one thing that it really taught me was that we have it really good with Visual Studio. So I'm going to let that warm up. After I go through the next slide, I'll talk about this. It's going to take a minute for that emulator to start up. So. All right, so that was the demo for the Android SDK. Hey, that was awesome. So in terms of the roadmap, that was the Android SDK. It's the first of many. We're going to go in popularity order and add a bunch more SDKs. We're going to do them all open source. We'll target both device and web platforms. And we're going to develop them, like I said, in open source projects that we're doing in concert with the community. So if you want to make submissions, if you want to make contributions, if you want to run ahead of where we've gotten and what we've contributed to those projects, please do so. And as we add more, we're going to do so and announce it on the Office developer blog. So go to Office Apps and watch there for announcements on future projects that we're adding. Trying to see if this emulator is going to boot up fast enough for me to switch over to that demo. Okay, so that's the Android experience, which I'll show you in just a second. The Android experience is an interesting experience. As you'll see in a minute, I basically have to, actually, I'll walk through the steps while it's booting. I basically have to go out to GitHub. Here's GitHub. Here's the Office 365 SDK for Android project. I can go get my Git URL, my clone URL. I can go into Eclipse. I import that clone URL in my Git Explorer. Then I import the project. I create all the connections between those things. I go out to the Azure Active Directory portal like I showed you a minute ago. I create a new application. I take all the values for that, the client ID that I had, the authority URL that I had, the domain that I'm building the application for. I put it into my project here. And then I take the SDK code and I build some really simple code to interact with the actual SharePoint services and Exchange services. So you'll see that actually in the main activity here. All I've got is a really simple SharePoint lists client that's just connecting to the resource ID URL and is just creating a new action to go and grab a list of item titles and pull them back in an array list. You can see the item titles here, pull them back in an array list, and then bind them to a control in my Android app. And we booted. I'll show you this thing actually running. But you can see there is still a decent amount of work. Getting set up is still a decent amount of work. Getting that SDK integrated, I have to go to the portal and manually go and create the application in the portal, keep track of all that data. I'm just going to hit Get Access Token. This is again using the Azure Active Directory Authentication Library, which is again an open source project for interacting with Azure Active Directory and handling that same web auth flow so that I can type in my username and password here. Actual runtime of the emulator is pretty slow too. I should... You thought you were going to get my password. And I'll hit sign in. It's going to go back with a token. Or actually, it's going to prompt me for the permission first because I signed in as a different user than my developer. I'm going to say, yep, it can read items in all site collections, hit OK. And then I'm just going to type in, I've got this random terms list. If I hit Go List Items, I'll actually pull up the random terms list. So here's the random terms list. You can see that it's returning back the same items. If I hit, I've got foobar, baz, bam, bash, pow. If I hit Git List Items, you can see it's just using the SDK to go and grab the SharePoint list items. So really simple demo. Building that simple demo takes a little work, but it's a whole lot simpler using the SDK than it would be on its own, and it's a whole lot simpler using Azure Active Directory than it would be on its own. To talk about the next demo, so that was the experience on Android. On Visual Studio, we've actually got some purpose-built tools for building these kinds of applications, whether you're building web applications or you're building Windows 8 applications. So if you go to Tools, Extensions, and Updates, and you go online and you search for, I've already got them installed, so I'll just show them to you. If you search for Office 365 API tools, these are publicly available. There's a download link on dev.office.com. You can go and install them. These are power tools for building device applications and websites that interact with Office 365 APIs in a really slick, seamless way. I've already got it installed here. You can install it directly from the Extensions and Updates menu in Visual Studio. And what I can do then is I can just go create a new project, and I'm just going to choose an ASP.NET MVC project here, or a web application project. I'm going to do an MVC project, turn off authentication, and hit OK. So right now I've just got a blank ASP.NET MVC application. It doesn't have any sort of authentication in it. It doesn't have any connections to any services. And what that tool, the Office 365 API tools, provides for me is the ability to right-click on this application and say Add Connected Service. And you'll see that Office 365 APIs are now listed here as a connected service for me. And I can go ahead and hit Sign In, type in my username and password, and authenticate. On Microsoft. And what this is actually doing is it's going and communicating with the Azure portal automatically, figuring out what services are available to me and making them available directly within Visual Studio. I can say I want to interact with SharePoint and hit OK. It's going to go back to the Azure portal and say what are the permissions available for SharePoint. I can say I want to be able to edit or delete items in all site collections. I can say whether I want to make this app available to my tenant only or to all tenants. I'm going to say all tenants and hit OK. It's going to go and add all the references to the right sample code and SDKs. It's going to add all the references to the right Azure Active Directory authentication library. It's going to add a bunch of sample code that actually has these SharePoint sample controllers already built inside of it that shows me a bunch of sample code for how to access it in Hello World. I'm actually going to go back into that connected service dialog. You'll see it's reentrant. It's going to show me that I have access already to SharePoint all sites. I'm going to add something to Exchange. And I'm going to say I want to be able to read users' calendars and read users' mail. Note, I'm not going to click read users' contacts, so I don't have permission to that. And again, I'm going to say I want it available on all tenants and hit OK. And again, it's going to add some sample code for Exchange. I'm going to go in here and I'm going to just add in to the layout some links. So I'm going to say, here's a link to SharePoint. And here's a link to Exchange. SharePoint sample and Exchange sample. And then if I go ahead and hit start, without really writing any code, all I did was edit some links there in the header of the navigation. I have a Hello World application. It automatically went out to the Windows Azure portal. It registered my application for me. Can actually go back here. And we can see that application. It's going to be named the same thing as my project when I hit F5. I can see the application that it registered. I can see the permissions that it registered for it. What did I name that project? Web Application 6. Very creative. So I can see the application. While it's doing that, I will open up this website that I just created. So I've got the application running. I can hit SharePoint. It's automatically going to prompt me for access again. So I'm going to sign in as, again, a different tenant. So I'll do the build O365 demo.onmicrosoft.com tenant. It's going to prompt me for access here to do the things that I asked for in Visual Studio. I'm going to hit OK. It's going to redirect back with a token, and then it's going to show me a list of all the documents in my Shared with Everyone folder automatically. I can do the same thing with Exchange. I can go to the Exchange mail, and I can see any mail, or I can do calendar, and it's going to take that same token. It's already got permission to get to my stuff. It doesn't need to ask me again for permission. It's going to hold on to that refresh token. You can see stuff on my calendar. Right after this, I got booth duty. And then if I click on contacts, remember I didn't ask for permission to contacts. So when I click on contacts, I should get an access denied message because the application doesn't have those permissions. And then if we go back, Azure Management Portal wants me to reload. If I go back to Azure Management Portal, I should be able to see that same application there. One last thing that I want to do real fast is I want to actually add another. So I'll just show it to you real quick. It just loaded. So you can see Web Application 6 here. And obviously, if I click in on that, you can see all the right redirect URIs. You can see all the right permissions that the app has asked for access to. One other thing that I want to do here is that I want to actually go and create a really simple demo application to show you what these APIs look like. So you can actually see some examples of APIs. So I'm going to add a new item. I'm going to add a controller, and I'll say MVC controller, and I'll call it O365 APIs demo, and hit add. In this controller, in the interest of time, I'm just going to go ahead and add my model in here too. So I'll say O365 APIs, and my model is just going to be a bunch of different APIs that I could want to call. So you'll see things like the HTTP method, the pattern of the request URL, the service endpoint, which is an enum that I have to add in here. So this is just a class that's defining the data structure for my model. Then in here, I'm actually going to put the actual data itself. So you'll see I've got an array here of those O365 API request demo objects, and it's got a bunch of examples. So this one is retrieve a list of all files in the user's OneDrive for Business. Here's what the URL looks like. You can see it's a really simple URL. It's just _API/files gets you the files. Very creative again. It's just a GET request, and we're calling SharePoint. If I want to retrieve the first 2 files, I can just add top 2 to the end. If I want to add a new file, I do /files/add, give the name, and post the file. So there's a bunch of different requests in here across SharePoint and Exchange. And then I'm going to add in a couple more pieces of sample code. I'm definitely running out of time, so I'm going to have to switch to my baked one here in just a second. I've got my O365 APIs. What I want to do is I want to ensure the service information. So this is going to help me figure out where Office 365 Services is, look up the user's OneDrive, for example, so I can fill in this particular placeholder, the 0 placeholder. Once I've got ensured information about the services, I want to actually process the demo URLs. So I need some helpers that will actually go through the demo URLs and format them to insert the OneDrive info and the Exchange info that I look up from Discovery. And then I want to go in here, and I want to put in some actual code to output that to a view. So I've got an index controller. I'm going to do an async task here. And you can see all it's doing is ensuring the service info. Then for each one of the demo URLs, it's going to add in a primary key so I can address it back. And then it's going to process those demo URLs to add in the right URLs. I am out of time, so I'm going to do one last thing here. I'm going to add in a view and go to list, choose that model class that I created, the O365 request demo. It's going to auto-generate a view for me. It won't be quite right, but you'll at least get the idea. I'm going to go out to O365 APIs demo/index. I'm going to sign in at build O365 demo. And then you can see I've got a bunch of these examples. I've got a GET, I've got the request pattern. This is the actual discovered URL for the full thing when I construct it. You can see the description, you can see the request body, and if I were to actually do the response, you can see the response. I've got the baked version of this that I'll show you real quick, which is the full thing end-to-end at o365apis demo.azurewebsites.net. So it's actually up there and published. You can see the thing that I just built. I can actually go to O365 API demos. I'll have to consent to this one separately. I'll hit OK. When I hit OK, this thing will go back, and it'll show me a slightly better formatted version of the same thing that I just built. So you can see GET, you can see the request URL pattern, you can see the description. You can see a details link, and when I click on the details link here, it's going to go and show you the actual full request URL and the actual response that you'll get from it running against your tenant when you go and sign in. And again, this is a public URL, o365apis demo.azurewebsites.net, so you can run it against your own O365 sites. And if you go back to this O365 APIs demo session, there's a link here to download all the snippets. So if you click on this, you'll get a zip file that has the snippets for every demo that I'm doing here, and one additional demo that there obviously wasn't time to fit in this particular session. So definitely download it and check it out if you want to do those full demos end-to-end. And if I go back to the slides, here's just a quick tiny URL, aka.ms/o365apis. That'll actually go to the site that I just built, the working one, the cake in the oven version of that one. And you can go and check it out for yourself, sign in with your own Office 365 account, play with the URLs, check out those APIs. I'll keep it up for a couple weeks so you can try it out on your own. And I'll probably add some more APIs as we go so you can see more examples. Give people just a second to take the pictures. OK, and it's in the deck too, so if you want to look at it later, you can certainly do that through the deck. So that's the end. Basically, there's a ton of new stuff coming for SharePoint, for apps, for device apps, for websites. There's even more than I could show here in the 60 minutes that we had. But the quick message is that, especially now with this new stuff we're releasing, you should go out and enrich your device applications and websites with service information coming from Office 365. And above all, this is preview features. Give us feedback about how it works, how it could be better, what else you want to see. Do it on User Voice, do it on Stack Overflow, and watch our blog for future announcements. And please, 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 give feedback about the session. Let me know how I can do better next time, what would be more helpful for you to learn, and definitely provide that feedback both here and on our User Voice site around the features that we're releasing. Thanks very much.